So let's go ahead and get started. Just a brief outline of the evening. We'll start with some practice together, and the meditation that I'm going to lead will hopefully help us clarify the difference between doing and not doing, which was a theme, a central theme of the Generative Contemplation Symposium that some of us attended here at UVA a couple months back. Then we'll have a break, which involves cookies. And then I wanted to share a little about this notion of the three turnings of the wheel of the Dharma as an organizing principle as we encounter, various teachings from different lineages and time periods of the Dharma. This can be a helpful frame to help make sense of it all. So that's the game plan for this evening. So let's start with some practice. And this might be a little different than usual. We're going to be practicing doing followed by non-doing for each of the three doors, what's called the three doors, which refers to our body, our breath, which is connected in with our subtle energy and speech, and then, of course, our mind. So let's start with the body, with doing something. So let's stretch just for a couple of minutes. So we can get up and put this mic down here. And we'll start just by standing in like a mountain pose. Standing very tall, noticing how the body is feeling. And then we can inhale the arms up overhead, reaching up for the sky. Either keep the palms apart or we can lace the fingers and press the palms up. And then we can sway off to one side and then coming back up and over to the other. Just back and forth a couple times. Good, and then reaching back up and floating the arms down. And if you want to move into the aisle here, away from the pews, we're going to be coming over the legs in just a moment. So we'll do a backward bending posture, then a forward bending posture. So we can have the hands in the hips here, and then we're going to drop the shoulders under and lift the chest up towards the ceiling. If it's comfortable, you can take the head back. If not, you can leave the chin in towards the chest. Couple of deep breaths here, filling the lungs. And then we can exhale to fold forward, bending the knees, and just hang over the legs. You can either let the arms dangle or hold the elbows in the hands. Knees are soft. And we can shake the head gently, yes and no, to make sure the neck is released. And then pretend that your torso was the trunk of an elephant and just begin to sway side to side, whether the arms are dangling or elbows are in hands. Freeing up through the low back. And then let's bend the knees and we'll roll very slowly up with the head being last to come up. And then reestablishing our mountain pose, perhaps a little bit taller than before. Then we can come back to our seat where we'll do a spinal twist to conclude our brief body practice. So we'll be twisting around to the right first, so we can bring the left hand to the outer right knee. If you're in a chair at home, you could hold on to the back of it. Maybe these pews would work for that. So inhale, lift the crown of the head up towards the sky, and then exhale, twist around to the right. Breathing deeply here. Maybe a teensy bit farther on an exhale, and then inhale, release back to center. Sitting nice and tall. Then we can bring the right hand to the outer left knee and holding the pew or the back of our chair, twisting around to the left, turning the head and even the eyes to the left. And then coming back to center. And begin to make those minor adjustments so that the body can be comfortable and still for the next few minutes. So once those mini adjustments are made, let's see what happens if we allow the body to be still, to do nothing. Scanning the body to see if there's some area of efforting. And just completely drop the effort. It may have been a very long time since we last completely stopped. We can notice here in stillness how the ground rises up to meet us, supporting the soles of the feet. How the solid groundedness of the pew or the chair rises up to support our seat. And perhaps noticing a shift as powerful muscles in the thighs and in the buttocks are allowed to soften and release. And soften the belly. And as the sky lifts the crown of the head up, notice if that allows the shoulders to drop back and down. As if the torso were your most comfortable coat, draped loosely on the support of the coat rack of our spine. and softening all the muscles of the face and the jaw. Even imagine relaxing the brain as if it were a muscle. And now, let's shift focus from this physical embodiment to the level of energy and breath. So before we do anything, just noticing the breath. And maybe you even notice the subtle energy, sometimes called prana or chi. Or maybe you don't notice that, which is equally as fine. So now let's begin to do something with the breath and thereby with the subtle energy by taking 3 deep breaths together with a holding of the breath at the top. Let's begin with a full exhale, drawing the navel back towards the spine, and then a deep inhale down into the belly, up into the chest. Hold the breath in for a moment or two, and then a long, smooth exhale through the nose. Exhaling every drop of breath. And then again, a long, deep inhale, filling the belly, filling the chest and the upper chest. Holding the breath in. And a long, smooth exhale. And once more, even more deeply, inhale up into the chest and some new corner of the lungs. Holding the breath in. And then that long, smooth exhale. And now let's drop that pranayama or breathing exercise and just let the breath return to its normal rhythm and take care of itself. And we may notice that there are some subtle plans to manage or control the breath, even in a very subtle way. Let's see if we can let those go and instead trust that the breath knows how to take care of itself. No need for us to intervene, to control, or manage, or fix. Now let's hone in a little bit more, noticing that natural pause at the end of an exhale before the next inhale happens on its own. Just relaxing into that space between breaths. Without efforting. And now let's shift focus to the third door, the mind. So with effort, let's fix the mind on that space between breaths. So that when the mind wanders off, we apply effort to bring it back to the feeling of the breath. A practice that we know very well, a shamatha practice. And now, drop the effort. Allow the mind to be free. Nothing to control. Nothing to manage. Nothing to fix. Neither grasping on to the thoughts, nor pushing them away. Simply allow any thoughts or emotions to drift through unimpeded, much like clouds drift across a clear blue sky. And then finally, let's shift the focus once more to the clear blue sky behind the thought clouds. Returning back home to that part of us that is the clear blue sky. Vast, luminous, awake, aware. I do want to acknowledge an awesome translator, Sarah Harding, of this book, Creation and Completion, that a lot of these concepts are very well summarized by an introduction by her in. And then also James Blumenthal, who unfortunately is no longer living. He was an associate professor of Buddhist philosophy at Oregon State and a professor of Buddhist studies at Maitripa College. And he had a very pithy article in Mandala magazine that I borrowed some of his pithiness for this talk, which I hope to keep pithy. All right, so just in terms of general orientation, the Buddha lived a long time ago. And in the millennium after he reached parinirvana, or passed away, there were a lot of different teachings that arose in the Indian subcontinent. And they can be classified in this framework of the three turnings of the wheel of the Dharma. And so this is a way that we can categorize the content, the philosophical view, and the practical application of a whole array of Buddhist teachings within the sutra stream of teachings, as opposed to the tantras, which I'll get to later. So turning the wheel is a metaphor for setting in motion of new teachings. So I brought like a tiny little Dharma chakra, the wheel, but it's that 8-spoked wheel. You may have seen pictures of it, yes? Yeah, so that's the metaphor, is that the wheel turns and then the vehicles of the Dharma proceed. And so these three turnings of the wheel mark three historical points at which new developments in Buddhist thought emerged in India. And all of these teachings are said to have been spoken by the historical Buddha, Buddha Shakyamuni. And the second and third turnings of the wheel, which are characterized as Mahayana, the great vehicle, they were not publicly known until centuries after the passing of Shakyamuni Buddha. So there are varying levels of acceptance of this model of the three turnings. So it's much more popular in the Tibetan, Himalayan Buddhist context. So you may not have heard of these concepts around the three turnings of the wheel of the Dharma. They are all said to originate with Buddha Shakyamuni during different phases of his teachings at different places, speaking to different audiences, and sometimes even simultaneously to different audiences. And why would the Buddha want to, have all these different teachings that sometimes seem to contradict each other? So it's said that the traditional explanation is that the Buddha taught these different turnings to different disciples and practitioners according to their propensities, what was meaningful and resonated with them, and also according to their capacities for understanding. And we can find references to this model of the three turnings of the wheel in the most famous sutra from the third turning, which is called the Sutra Unraveling the Thought, just in case you want a reference to go back and do more reading on this. All right, so that's just the overview of the three turnings of the wheel. So now we'll get actually into the three turnings. So the first one is one that we're probably the most familiar with here at IMCC. And it's said to have taken place at Deer Park in Sarnath, which is near Varanasi in northern India, to an audience of Shravakas. And this first turning of the wheel consisted of the teachings on the Four Noble Truths, and then the other elements in the Tripitaka, namely the Abhidharma, the Sutra Pitaka, and the Vinaya, the ethical and moral codes. So this first turning of the wheel corresponds to the teachings that the Buddha gave first in the earliest historical period of Buddhism and within Shakyamuni Buddha's teaching career, so to speak. And many of the teachings in this first turning of the wheel are fundamental to all schools of Buddhism. So there are things like the Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Path, selflessness, dependent arising, impermanence, the five aggregates, and perhaps the most famous of these suttas in this first turning of the wheel of Dharma is the one that records the Buddha's very first teaching there at Deer Park near Varanasi to his first 5 disciples. And this aptly is named the Turning of the Wheel of the Dharma Sutra. So that's one of the first references to this, this schema, this categorization framework. So virtually all of the contents of the Pali canon, of the Pali version of the Buddhist canon that are used by the Theravada Buddhists are considered by Tibetans, again, I want to make that differentiation, to be teachings from the first turning of the wheel of the Dharma. So they sort of set up this equation of Pali canon equals first turning of the wheel of the Dharma. So there may be disagreement even in this room about that, but according to Himalayan Buddhism, that's the story, and they're sticking with it. Right, let's see what else I had on the first turning of the wheel. Yeah, so among the important concepts in this phase of Buddha's teachings was the dependent and interrelated nature of all phenomenal reality. And that really is the overarching vision that the Buddha experienced during the night that he awakened underneath the Bodhi tree. And if we're able to understand the intricate relationship of all phenomena, all things, and particularly our own emotional and conceptual patterns, then we can break the cycle of suffering. And then, of course, there's the concept of ignorance, this belief in the myth of self and the dualistic thinking that it spawns. And so as it goes in the progression, ignorance leads to attachments and aversions and other afflictive emotions, and then those in turn give rise to actions and their consequences, which is karma, and those are the sources of suffering. So this idea of non-self is a crucial idea presented in the first turning of the wheel. The final thing I'll say about this first turning of the wheel is the people who received and practiced these teachings were called arhats. And this group includes a lot of the earliest disciples, and the way of life that was stressed among these arhats was one of renunciation and moral discipline. And the goal was to attain one's own liberation from samsara, from the endless cycle of existence. So we can think of first turning of the wheel arhats with the goal primarily of one's own liberation. And these teachings from the first turning of the wheel developed over time into 18 plus different schools, and I believe the only extant one today that's remaining is the Theravada school that's practiced throughout Southeast Asia. Right, so that is the sweeping overview of the first turning of the wheel of the Dharma. Let's fast forward a few hundred years to the second turning, and this turning of the wheel of the Dharma was said to have taken place at a place called Vulture Peak Mountain in Rajagriha, which is in Bihar in the northern part of India. And there were some arhats there and some shravakas, but there are also some bodhisattvas there as well. And more about that in a moment. Now, the main difference here with the second turning, a couple of main differences, is the emphasis on emptiness that is encapsulated in the Prajnaparamita Sutra, the perfection of wisdom. That was the mantra that was playing in the song during the break. And not to go into too much philosophical detail here, but a difference with the second turning of the wheel of the Dharma is in the first turning, Buddha taught the selflessness of people, but also taught that entities, things, do exist in the way that they appear. And in the second, in this refinement of the concept of emptiness that appears in the second turning of the wheel, there's a new description of reality in these Perfection of Wisdom sutras. And in those sutras, the Buddha taught that all persons and all phenomena or things and experiences are characterized not only by selflessness, but the more subtle and profound term of emptiness, or shunyata in the Sanskrit, which means that everything is, it's not a void in a nihilistic way, but rather an emptiness of independent, unchanging essence. So there's often a misunderstanding around this notion of emptiness, that it's like this black void, where nothing exists. But what the emptiness is referring to, an emptiness of inherent existence, or this independent, I exist independently in my own little bubble from you guys and from everything else. So that's what's being negated here. And so later on, Nagarjuna expanded on the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras and developed a new philosophical school called the Madhyamaka, or the Middle Way. But I won't go into detail around that. It's just the middle way between extremes of thinking, into things, exist definitely independently, and also that nihilistic other end of the spectrum. So the Madhyamaka takes that middle way approach. So if we were to try to place the second turning of the wheel of the Dharma on the historical timeline, it would be between 100 BCE and 100 CE. So right around the time that Jesus Christ lived. And just a few more words about this view of emptiness within the second turning of the wheel. So there's this notion of the two truths. So there's, on one level, there is a lack of independent existence of all phenomena, and that is a level that is called absolute truth sometimes. But simultaneously, on an ordinary level, we are sitting here in a church in pews, and we probably don't yet have an experience of absolute truth. I certainly don't. So there's this notion that both of these levels of reality are operating at the same time, the absolute and the relative or conventional truth. So on this level of conventional truth, karma still applies. So there is cause and effect. There are consequences to what we do, both positive and negative. And so this is another way that in this middle way philosophy, where we're looking at finding a middle path between this ultimate truth and a relative truth. The other thing that the second turning of the wheel of the Dharma is famous for is this quality of compassion. So this recognition that other beings are stuck in suffering, and that's because there is a lack of understanding of this concept of emptiness and how things truly are. So suffering is not inevitable, but it is self-perpetuating unless we can gain insight through meditation practice into how this pattern of samsara arises. So the idea is that as we begin to understand the true nature of reality more deeply, we naturally, when we recognize interdependence, feel less self-cherishing like I, me, mine, and we start to grow qualities of compassion. And it's often described that, and you've probably heard this analogy, that compassion and emptiness, or wisdom realizing emptiness, that those are the two wings of a bird flying to awakening. So they're both necessary and equally important. A couple of other closing thoughts on the second turning of the wheel of the Dharma is that the way out is through our meditative practice, so through experiential knowledge and not just philosophical noodling and contemplation. So the idea is that we remove the ground that these false notions of reality stand on, and then that once we have no concepts to cling to, the causes of suffering are no longer operating, and that's when wisdom, or the opposite of ignorance, arises. And so I mentioned with the first turning of the wheel of the Dharma, practitioners are primarily the arhats, and for the second turning of the wheel is this notion of the bodhisattva, one who aspires to enlightenment for the purpose of benefiting others. So that's the driving force, is this notion of bodhicitta, the altruistic aspiration to enlightenment. So the lifestyle for these practitioners within the second turning of the wheel, the motivation is more one of great compassion. In addition to the discipline and the ethical conduct that is a hallmark of the first turning of the wheel of the Dharma. So in this way, with the focus on compassion and doing good deeds and practicing what are known as the 6 perfections of generosity, morality, patience, moral discipline, effort, and concentration, and wisdom, by practicing these paramitas are one of the main aspects of the path in this in Mahayana Buddhism. And so for this reason, monastic life is not as emphasized in Mahayana practice. It's not as important whether you're ordained or not. So there's more involvement among lay people within this second turning of the wheel of the Dharma, and another name for that is the Mahayana, or the Great Vehicle. All right, I am staying on track time-wise. I was giving myself 5 minutes for each turning of the wheel, so we have enough time for sharing. So we're up to the third turning of the wheel of the Dharma. And this happened later on, historically. And there's an aspect of this third turning of the wheel that relates to sutras, the exoteric teachings that are written down. And then there's an aspect that relates to the tantras, or the more esoteric literature. So one of the main ideas in this third turning of the wheel of the Dharma that's different is this notion of Buddha nature, or Tathagata Garbha, which are traditionally categorized in this third turning of the wheel of the Dharma. So this concept was elaborated on by Maitreya in the 5 treatises of Maitreya, and also was emphasized by the Yogacara school, who were connected with the mind-only school in Buddhist philosophy. So I'm going to skip the differences between the mind-only school and the middle way school, because those can be a little bit boring in those philosophical differences. But we do have this concept of Buddha nature, or our inherent potential for enlightenment. And this can be experienced as a radiant awareness or a knowing capacity of the mind, kind of like that clear blue sky that we visited in the meditation, perhaps. And this Buddha nature, as you know, is an integral part of every single sentient being, and endows that being with the opportunity to awaken and to be enlightened. So that in this context, enlightenment refers to the full recognition and realization of our Buddha nature, which is already there. So in this third turning of the wheel of the Dharma, the goal is still the liberation of all sentient beings. So that makes it part of the Mahayana, the great vehicle, because of that intention. So this idea of Buddha nature within the third turning of the wheel of the Dharma leads me into this concept of the esoteric teachings in Himalayan Buddhism, which are go by different names. So names include Tantra, Yogic Buddhism, Himalayan Buddhism, Vajrayana, the thunderbolt or indestructible vehicle. So there are different names for this esoteric tradition in contrast to the exoteric sutra stream of teachings. So the word Tantra refers to a special type of literature, but it also refers to the teachings in those books, in those tantras, and also the practice of them. So the path of Tantra, and Tantra means there's an aspect of to weave or continuum, and there's a mention of weaving in all aspects of our experience across the continuum. So this Vajrayana, this is sometimes classified as a third vehicle. So there's the Theravada, which the Mahayana folks will, in a horrible way, call it the Hinayana, the lesser vehicle, which I absolutely hate. It's so insulting. So in that context of the three vehicles, the lesser vehicle, the great vehicle, then the Vajrayana is sometimes classified as a third vehicle, but it's actually part of the Mahayana, the second one. So anyhow, one other name for this system of esoteric literature and practice is secret mantra, because of the widespread use of mantras and sounds and seed syllables. So there are, tantras exist both in the Hindu and the Buddhist tradition going way back, and it's kind of unclear how much the Hindu and Buddhist tantras influenced each other. But it's said that the Buddhist tantras were taught by Buddha Shakyamuni. So some might disagree with that, particularly in the Theravada schools, at least traditionally. And the main emphasis in Buddhist Tantra is the natural purity or our intrinsic perfection of all beings, so tying into this Buddha nature. And then the method for realizing this is what is quite different. And it's around cultivating pure perception or sacred outlook, so viewing everything, every person as a Buddha, that we're here in a pure land in the Unitarian Church. So there's this invitation to already be at our destination. And wow, how would that change things if we were able to maintain this pure perception? And there are kind of some unconventional things about the practice of Tantra. So, things like wandering around in graveyards and, drinking and sex, and I don't want to talk about that so much because I don't want to contribute to these, misinformation that is so much sadly out there about Tantra. People think Tantra equals sex. Actually, a very tiny part of Tantra might involve it when you're very, very, very far along in the path, but most of it does not. So nevertheless, there are these kind of unusual and unconventional approaches that are geared towards breaking through our ordinary perceptions and inhibitions to get to a non-conceptual understanding of our true nature. So some of these techniques that are different are visualization of enlightened forms, such as particular deities or mandalas, and also working with the subtle energy in our psychophysical body to help us to recognize our ultimate inherent true nature as Buddhas. All right, so that is what I wanted to share with you about the 3 turnings of the wheel of the Dharma. And thank you for your patience. This was not quite as well organized as I was hoping it would be by next Tuesday. So I'd like to open it up to questions, to comments, to things that you disagreed with, to spirited debate. Yes. Here, I'll bring this over to you.
Hi. You were talking about compassion, and I feel like it's kind of a word that people throw around a lot, and I was wondering if there's a specific definition within Buddhism that you could speak to.
Yeah, great question. And what's your name? Jenny, great. So yeah, compassion is the wish for all beings to be free from suffering. So that's a nice definition. Yeah. Yeah, it differs from love, which traditionally is the wish for all beings to be happy. Yeah. Questions, comments? Yes. Do you have your hand up?
No, I didn't.
Oh, you didn't. I'm seeing things. No, that's okay.
It's more for me of a historical, like conceptual understanding of the evolution of Buddhism maturing or whatever. So honestly, it's so hard for me to come up with a question or a comment, even though I really appreciate your talk.
Sorry to put you on a spot by the imaginary hand that I thought you had raised.
So I just want to clarify when you were talking about bodhisattvas. I don't even know where I learned this, but my understanding of a bodhisattva is they have been liberated, but they choose to stay until all beings are liberated. Is that? Until all beings are liberated, until all beings are free.
So there's different levels of realization among bodhisattvas. So, and my understanding is that there's different levels among bodhisattvas, going from the simplest of someone who has cultivated bodhicitta, who has a genuine desire to awaken for the benefit of other beings. And then, there are these higher level, beings who are able to control their rebirth and come back voluntarily to, help release, all beings from suffering until every single person is released, and then they're the last ones to go. Can you be a bodhisattva and not know it? I would agree with that. I think certainly many people from all kinds of faith traditions, are just saints, and we might call them bodhisattvas, but I think you have to develop an intention to actually be a bodhisattva, and I could be wrong on this, but I think you actually have to have the intention and the awareness that, oh yes, I am committing to awakening for the benefit of other beings. But it's a good question. It's a really good question. Anyone on Zoom?
I got a question, Matt.
David.
Hi, Matt. How are you?
Good.
Good. So I had a question. See if I can say it. So if I understood your definition of compassion, it was the desire to see all beings become enlightened. And what I came across or learned at some point was that compassion was the quivering of the heart in response to suffering and the desire to offer relief, which I guess could be defined in different ways, but for me, the image of that is more concrete than wishing for all beings to be enlightened. It's more like if someone's hungry, feed them. And I wondered from that functionally is there more emphasis actually on, I guess, charity or concrete actions to help people who are suffering in Himalayan Buddhism than there is in what is practiced in Southeast Asia and the Theravadan Buddhism practice there?
Good question. So first of all, I would say that I'm not sure I would define compassion as the wish for all beings to reach enlightenment. That would be lovely. I think it's a great aspiration. I've heard compassion more defined as the wish for all beings to be free of suffering. And the aspiration of a bodhisattva who has cultivated bodhicitta is to realize, to awaken, to reach enlightenment for the benefit of others. So I think if you kind of combine those two, you might get to a wish for all beings to be enlightened. But just wanted to clarify that piece. And then around, this great question around engaged action, to what extent, are these different schools of Buddhism committed to and engaged in, action to reduce suffering. I don't feel super comfortable comparing, Theravadins and Himalayan practitioners in that respect. I would say that, in the Theravada, there's more of an emphasis on, as I understand it, and please correct me if I'm wrong, Teresa and anyone else, that in the Theravadan school and system of practice, there's more of an emphasis on the monastics and on supporting monastics, and there's more of a role in Himalayan Buddhism for the lay practitioner to be going out and practicing the 6 perfections, which include things like generosity and patience and things that as householders we're all asked to cultivate on a daily basis. And so that's how I would see the differences in types of engaged action between the Theravadan and the Himalayan Buddhists. Would anyone like to add to that or disagree with that? Jenny, I saw your hand again. Yeah.
So just based on your definition of compassion, I'm just wondering if wanting someone else not to suffer can become a form of attachment. Because I know I've experienced suffering based on witnessing other people suffer that I cared about, which causes all kinds of turmoil. So I'm just curious what that means within Buddhism as a total, novice.
Don't sound like a novice. That's a great question. Yes, I do think it's possible to become attached to the wish for all beings to be free of suffering. And then, so I think that's where discernment comes into play, is to be able to differentiate between situations where we can help the other to reduce their own suffering. Because, we each have our own karma, and no Buddha can come in and change my karma. I mean, that would be great if a Buddha were able to come in and say, hey, all those bad things you did, Matt, in the first half of your life, I'm letting you free from that. But I think that is one aspect of Buddha's practice where, we as bodhisattvas, we can support each other and help each other to be free of suffering. But when it comes to actually doing the work and working with, karma that we've accumulated during this life or in past lifetimes, we're basically on our own. So, yeah, but it's a very good question. And I think it's important to be sensitive to, when I'm becoming attached to this person whom I love being free from suffering, and applying discernment to when it's appropriate to let go of that. Yes, Teresa.
I was thinking about your question and thinking about the four immeasurables which you referenced tonight, and the middle way, or the balance between compassion, kindness, and equanimity. So how it is that we respond to suffering, as David said, when the heart quivers in response to someone else's suffering. And then we also see that with regard to equanimity, each person has their own journey, their own karma. And as much as I would like to relieve everyone's suffering, I cannot do that. And to just hold those with some measure of balance. Thanks, Matt.
Thank you, Teresa. Oh, yes, Jean.
So I think you did a great job, Matt, with defining and helping clarify this structure, these three turnings. And I think that the difference is, I think one thing that you emphasized very nicely is that the differences are kind of all contained in in what the Buddha taught. It's like a different emphasis on things. And that I think that contributes to the richness of Buddhism. So I wanted to thank you for doing such a good job with that.
Thanks, Jean.
Okay.
Dan.
Did you refer to Maitreya Buddha as an actual person, historical figure? Or?
Maitreya is said to be the next Buddha, future Buddha. But there are embodiments that are Buddha.
That's how I understood it. I was in a temple once in Asia, and guy was giving me a tour of the temple, and there was a statue, and I asked, who's that? He said, Maitreya Buddha, that's the future Buddha, that could be you. Which I I thought was pretty cool. I guess one feeling I have from your presentation, which was very skillful this evening, is the almost overwhelming richness of the whole tradition. And it's like, as a practitioner, you just have to, it feels to me like you have to make choices and sort of, I don't know, it's almost like there's too much to deal with. And I think once I saw something about the Buddhas only point the way, but it's your job to do it. And that's sort of how I feel about it. It's like, wow, there's so much to draw from that it's almost like drinking from a fire hose.
Thanks, Dan. So we have just about 2 minutes left, but please.
So you were saying, I think at the beginning, something about letting go of effort during the meditation, trying not to get anywhere. There's this concept of emptiness and freedom. And that's nice and that feels good. The idea of emptiness doesn't feel good, but there does seem to be this goal, which is kind of why I show up or sit. But then there isn't a goal. So it's holding both. Emptiness means fullness and wholeness. So I guess.
Yeah. First of all, I love your mention of the pathless path, or Chogyam Trungpa called it. He wrote a book called Journey Without a Goal. So there is that aspect to practice. And then as far as a definition for emptiness, I think it's just important to recognize that it's not the nihilism. It's not this assertion that nothing exists. It's just that things don't exist in the way that we think that they do. So it's an emptiness of, it's a voidness of things and people existing independently or inherently from their own side. So I am empty. I would not be here without my mother giving birth, and UVA, giving me some money for working there, and the great people who built this church. So you can also kind of equate it with interdependence is another way to describe it, that it avoids the semantic challenges of that word emptiness. Or as you defined it, fullness. That's another great way. Because when things are empty of an inherent existence, there's nothing that's tying us down. The sky's the limit. It's full of possibility, full of potential, pure potential. Yeah. Right, I don't want to keep you here all night. It's traditional to close with a dedication of merit, so I'll just do a 1 verse 1. And as I'm doing that, you can feel free to dedicate the merit of our practice in your own way for the benefit of all beings. May the pure, brilliant sun of bodhicitta dawn in each and every heart and mind, dispelling the darkness of suffering unstoppably until all are fully illumined and awakened. Thank you, and good night.